Yeah, my name is Brad Geiger and I'm a cartoonist. I've been doing comics since February 2000 when I started posting comics online. Comics was my one thing. It's the only thing I ever wanted to do. It was my only obsession. Other kids wanted to be an astronaut or a baseball player or a chef. I wanted to be Burt Breathed or Ernie Bushmiller. At that time, newspaper comics. I read Marvel comics and I dreamed about drawing Spider-Man, and so I always was working on comics in one form or another all the way through my life. What you do is you get a job in a newspaper in the editorial department and then submit your comics on the side. And I ended up working in newspapers for 20 years. A full-page comic that I ran in the Philadelphia Daily News for about a year and a half that talked about everyday life in Philadelphia. I would share some of my stories about Philly, and then I'd say, hey, send me your story. Tell me, an interesting story about where you live. And people would send me their stories, and I would turn them into comics. My parents did not get it. In Michigan, it was the heart of the auto industry. The idea of being a cartoonist for a living was absolutely bizarre to my parents. They could not get their heads around it. Having said that, at every chance they got, they supported it. The only thing that my dad ever said that was tinged with a shade of doubt was he said, maybe you get a teaching degree to fall back on. Not for nothing, it wasn't bad advice. The only problem is if you have a fallback, you'll probably use it, and you'll probably never become the thing you wanted to become. I've published at this point well over 24 books, including collections of Evil Inc., which is it started out as a daily comic strip about a corporation run by supervillains. Greystone Inn was my first comic strip, which was very opaque, had a very, very complicated premise, which is why it probably failed. It was a comic strip inside a comic strip starring a gargoyle. Evil Inc. was actually a spin-off of Greystone Inn. I spent an entire weekend in Toronto at the Toronto Comic Convention, during which nobody stopped at my table. And I was doing Greystone Inn at the time. And I heard myself pitching this comic over and over and over again, and nobody slowed down, right? So I kind of got the hint that I should probably rethink this a little bit. And on the plane home, I wrote the first 2 weeks of Evil Inc. and made the decision on the plane that I was going to switch up. Everything in the early 2000s, the big push at that point was really based on newspaper comic strips. That was the thing that really first made the leap to the web, for the primary reason that at that point you really needed something that published every day. And people didn't even know what a webcomic was. We had to build a website pre-social media and try to hope that somebody would bump into it. We had to lead people through this. It was kind of fascinating. During that time, success could be absolutely disastrous because bandwidth and server costs were very expensive. I had friends that got very, very popular and had to shut down because they couldn't afford to keep running their website. Most of the desktop monitors that I was designing for were 800 pixels by 600 pixels. I was designing entire websites, entire horizontal comics for something that had a lower resolution than your typical Instagram. Starting around 2013 and steadily going up, we enter an amazing time for independent comics on the web, of people being able to do this kind of stuff that they want, comic strips and comic books, and making a living without a gatekeeper, without a syndicate or a publisher and an editor to tell, no, you don't fit, you don't belong. And we have our first real golden age of webcomics. We had epic fights, print versus web. As newspapers are going down and people like me are saying, hey, I can publish this on the web. I don't need anybody looking over my shoulder. What happened was, as people like me were doing this, syndicated cartoonists, people whose work was being syndicated into newspapers, hated us because they saw us as giving our work away for free. We never had mentors in comics because they did not want to talk to us. oh, the fights would get just nasty, and they would go on for days. And so obviously we won. We're still here. They're not. The irony is that without print, I couldn't make a living. In other words, print is a big part of my annual revenue. National Cartoonist Society. It was a professional organization of cartoonists, and they would get together once a year for a big black tie party. They had the Reuben Awards, and when I became a professional cartoonist, I applied for membership. You can't be a member. And I said, why not? They said, well, because you don't make most of your living from comics. I said, yeah, I make a good chunk of it. I've got a day job, but I make money on advertising and merchandising. They said, no, it's got to come from publications. It's got to come from print. It's got to come from newspapers and magazines. I said, well, that's not me. They said, well, then you're not a cartoonist. The biggest organization of people that I would have given my left arm to have met, which makes it so nice that last year I got nominated for one of the Reuben Awards. I went to the Reuben Awards for the first time ever last year. I met Jim Davis, who created Garfield. I told him how much he absolutely lit up an 80-year-old Brad Geiger's life. It was kind of nice. Finally, after a long time saying you don't belong, I realized that the world had changed and I belonged just as much as any one of those guys. When we had gotten ourselves that first generation of webcomics, when we got to a certain point in our careers, it became important to me particularly to be a mentor to younger people, because I never had that. So my friend and I, who's been doing comics for as long as I have, Dave Kellett and I, started a podcast called Comic Lab. We've updated it twice a week for 6 years. The books that I've written on comics were my attempt to try to do mentorship. But if anyone is looking for information or looking for guidance, I want to make sure that they've got at least one option, because I remember how much it stunk not to be able to talk to those older generation cartoonists that were at one point my heroes. You want to hear my number one piece of advice? It's written on the first page of my book, the Webcomics Handbook. It's almost impossible to get worse at something you do every day. Because the more you do it, and the more passion you put into it, the better you become.